Hello? Can you see me and hear me? Uh, I don't think so. I mean, I'm just talking into the system. You're muted, Anna. We're. Oh, okay. Yeah, there we go. I was waiting on the kilos, and they just said, "Can you send me the link?" I can. I can do that. Uh, ooh, there's 8. What's up, 8? Hey, Kyle. I can go let him in. Talk amongst yourselves. You're the one that's talking. They're possibly going to be doing an event out here, which is. Out here? Yeah, so that's all close that door. Multi-purpose joint. Yes, it is.
There's another chair somewhere.
Hey, you can come sit on the seat with us, man.
Well, I want to feel like I'm too close and pay for the space. You know, I'm trying to do the 6 foot thing still.
Same.
I want you to say that. I gave you that. That rock I gave it to you. It's nice wood floors, other floors. That's you. Yeah. I love this view, man.
Let me see. The Masons are in. I thought. Yeah, Alex is logged in on. Let me look. Meeting password is okay. You're good. There we go. All right, y'all. Well, welcome to the final night of our Zoom class. We'll go ahead and get started. Kyle is magically in the kitchen and he's about to magically be teaching in your Zoom. So just let that blow your mind in a hot moment. But yeah, so we're going to let Kyle do the teaching. And then what we will do after that is we will still do what we always do, which is open it up for dialogue and discussion. And that'll all be done here on Zoom. What I'm going to try and do, since we have so many people on Zoom and this is the way the conversation is going to happen, is hopefully I think I have it figured out how to push the Zoom to YouTube. So if we have some technical difficulties with sound and audio after the lecture, let me know. Don't live with a terrible echo. So we're trying to do the sound thing and this tech thing well. But yeah, so anyways, we're going to kick it over to the video of Kyle teaching, and then we'll have our discussion.
Well, good evening, Mosaic. We're so glad you guys are here with us. I'm obviously not at the Battery. I am in the house. My family was exposed to the virus this week. Max had a child in his classroom at school who tested positive. Their family has gotten it. And so if you pray for their school, that would be great. Pray for our family. We're still waiting on results from that. Everybody's still feeling okay, but a little bit under the weather. So if you guys would certainly pray for us. But we're going to continue. I'm excited to be able to continue in our class that we've been doing regarding politics and race and the history of America and how we understand these things, the history and what it looks like to move forward. We're excited about all of this, about how the conversation can continue, how we as believers in the city of Birmingham can continue to reflect and pray on these things rather than seeing this as a momentary sort of response to what's going on around us. We see this as really sort of a doorway into something new, a new way of seeing our city and church and what it means to follow Jesus in regards to racial reconciliation. And that's what we want to talk about tonight, is kind of what's the next step. What does it look like for us to move forward? How do we step into reconciliation in a real way as individuals, as the church, as a city? What can that look like? And a lot of that obviously is very simple, and a lot of it's very complex and difficult, but we want to try and deal with that particular question. And tonight I wanted to begin with Philemon, actually. Many of you are probably familiar with the letter to Philemon. It's written by Paul. Philemon is a very short letter. If you've never read it, you should. It's shorter than most of the Psalms that you read, and it's very easy to digest, yet it's profound in the sense that it is addressing slavery in the history of the church and how believers should see slavery and respond to slavery. You see Old Testament texts that do the same thing, but this is a New Testament text dealing directly with a matter of slavery, and so it can be really helpful. So if you would, I'm just going to read verses 8 through 16 of the book of Philemon. Paul says, "Therefore, although in Christ I could be bold and order you to do what you ought to do, yet I prefer to appeal to you on the basis of love. It is as none other than Paul, an old man and now also a prisoner of Christ Jesus, that I appeal to you for my son Onesimus, who became my son while I was in chains. Formerly he was useless to you, but now he has become both useful to you and to me. I'm sending him, who is my very heart, back to you. I would have liked to keep him with me so that he could take your place in helping me while I am in chains for the gospel. But I did not want to do anything without your consent, so that any favor you do would not seem forced, but would be voluntary. Perhaps the reason he was separated from you for a little while was that you might have him back forever, no longer as a slave, but better than a slave, as a dear brother. He is very dear to me, but even dearer to you, both as a fellow man and as a brother in the Lord. Now, if you know anything about the letter of Philemon, historically, you know that this has been one of the texts in the New Testament used by people within the church and outside the church as a means of justifying slavery as an institution. This has been a text that people have used to say Christians can own slaves, because here is a Christian slave owner. It's used to defend slavery over and over again. And if you look at the text at the simplest sort of level, you do see Paul send a runaway slave back to his Christian owner. And one can conclude, at the simplest sort of level, if one wants to manipulate this text and use it to affirm one's own sort of beliefs about race and slavery, you could manipulate it and say, if Paul sends a runaway slave back to his owner, that means we also ought not to harbor runaway slaves. We also ought to not feel any need to defend those who are slaves or fight for their rights or freedoms, because even Paul himself doesn't do that. He sends the runaway slave back, and Paul calls a man who owns slaves a Christian, a brother of his. He calls him a friend. He sees Philemon in this particular way, despite the fact that he owns slaves. And so that could be used by many people to assume that Christians can do this sort of thing. And many people used it to defend slavery for a long time. But if you dig a little bit deeper, if you scrape at the surface, if you take seriously what Paul is doing and you pay attention to so many of the hints that he continues to drop for Philemon, you see that he's doing more. The way the story is playing out is that Philemon, as a slave owner, has known Onesimus for many years. And Onesimus, remember, is in a different sort of slavery than what we are used to historically here in the United States. Chattel slavery was a different thing. We talked about that weeks ago. What we're talking about here with Onesimus is something more like indentured servitude. It was a finite period of time in which he would have chosen to be a slave in order to pay off some debt. He would have committed himself to Philemon, but he has balked on that. He's backed out on it completely, and he's run away. And so it's a complicated situation, because Philemon is a believer. Onesimus eventually becomes a believer after running away. He meets Paul in another city. And it's in his relationship with Paul, coming into the church, that he comes to call himself a Christian. He begins to follow Jesus. And that changes everything for Paul and for Onesimus. They want to deal with this issue, this controversy in Onesimus' life. Because the situation is complex, right? You have two men. They are both believers, but one is a slave and the other is his master. And this would have happened. It would have played out over and over again in the early church. It was a tension for them. How are we to deal with this? Because we have this institution which is kind of expected in the ancient world. It's known throughout the ancient world, and no one is pushing against it. And yet in the church, there has to be a different approach to it. Both of these men are Paul's friends. Paul finds himself in a very strange situation, and yet Paul here is using his influence. He's using his voice. We might say, in our modern day language, we might say that he's kind of leveraging his privilege here. He has a tight-knit relationship with Philemon, and he's leveraging that relationship here. He's leveraging the voice that he has in Philemon's life for Onesimus' sake. He's trying to find a way to better Onesimus' situation. And he's using his own influence. He's using his own privilege here to do all of that. Yes, Paul does send a runaway slave back to his owner. But if you notice the language being used here, Paul is sending him back not as a slave to his master. He's sending him back as a dear brother to Philemon. He's not sending him back as a slave. He's sending him back redefining who Onesimus is to be in Philemon's life, a brother. He's saying, receive him as a brother and not as the runaway slave that you remember him as. Receive him as a brother. No longer a slave working for you, but a partner working alongside you for the purposes of the kingdom. Just as Paul and Philemon have worked alongside one another in the church, Paul is saying, you ought to allow this relationship to be transformed such that he's no longer the runaway slave. He's your brother. And that, I think, is what's so important about this letter. Paul is not just urging Philemon to forgive Onesimus. Paul is not just urging Philemon to spare the life of Onesimus. If you remember, in Rome, there was one punishment that was intended specifically for slaves, for the lowest: crucifixion. The same death that was dealt to Jesus. And Paul is not pleading with Philemon to not crucify Onesimus. He's not asking him to merely spare the life of Onesimus, or just to forgive Onesimus and allow Onesimus to come back and fulfill the promise that he had made, the commitment that he had made to Philemon. Instead, he's pushing it a step further. He goes another step toward reconciliation. And I think that's something we need to recognize, is that there is really two steps in this process. Forgiveness is part of the process of healing, but reconciliation is the other. And there are many times where we're willing to go as far as forgiveness, but reconciliation is more difficult and complex. And we don't often push that far. What Paul is saying here is he's not seeking this sort of warm, fuzzy kind of reunion. This isn't just about Onesimus and Philemon hugging it out and deciding that everything's okay. He's not angry and they can now go back to normal. No, he's completely transforming their relationship. They are now partners, they're now brothers working for the same purpose. And that purpose is the kingdom. That is reconciliation. It's a different thing. It's a transforming of their relationship. Not merely mending what has been done wrong, but completely transforming it altogether, such that the wrong which has been done is now only a part of the story of how they got to where they are as brothers. There's something really beautiful about that. This is real reconciliation. It's revolutionary, and this is the heart of what it means to follow Jesus. This is how we are to see racial reconciliation. This is what we should be seeking. This is what we're after. That's our hope. That's the step that we want to make towards reconciliation. Not merely learning the story, not merely figuring out what all of this history looks like. I think that's important, right? Seeking forgiveness. I think that's important. Trying to find ways in our nation, in the church, of seeking forgiveness, of acknowledging the wrongs that have been committed. That is part of the process. But reconciliation is something more, right? We can't just learn these things. We can't just seek forgiveness and then just hope to move on. Hope that this tense moment will subside and we'll be able to go back to normal. That is not what reconciliation looks like. And I think for many of us, at the simplest human kind of level, we don't like the tension that exists right now in our society. We see the way things are playing out, and we want that tension to subside. We want it to come to an end. And so a lot of what we're doing right now, a lot of what we see happening in our nation right now, and even in the church among people, is we want to see the tension finally end. We want to see the warring that seems to come to the surface in moments like these culturally, to come to an end. We want to find peace, right? But reconciliation is more than just trying to make things better, more than just trying to smooth things over. Reconciliation is another step altogether. It's real reconciliation that we're seeking. And the reality is that's not so simple. It's complex. It's not easy at all. And it's sometimes really painful. I'm reminded of a quote. I've been reading through Toni Morrison's book, Beloved. And in Beloved, there's this scene where there's a runaway slave. And this runaway slave, Seeth, has come into contact with a young white girl. And for some reason, this young white girl is favorable toward her, is kind toward her. And obviously, as a runaway slave, she has no shoes. Her feet are swollen because she's pregnant and she's been on the run. And there's this moment where this young white girl begins to rub her feet. And it's so painful. She describes the pain that she's feeling in her feet. And the girl looks at her and she says, anything that's been dead coming back to life always hurts. Anything that is dead trying to come back to life always hurts, right? It's a beautiful picture of the reality of resurrection. Sometimes resurrection is this painful process. Sometimes reconciliation, a dead relationship, a broken relationship that has existed between blacks and whites in our nation, anytime that is being massaged back to life, it is painful. And that's the reality we have to recognize. There's another quote that's been really helpful for me. It comes from Richard Wright. You may be familiar with Richard Wright. Maybe you've read Native Son in college or high school. Maybe you read Black Boy. This is a quote from Black Boy. And I think it's really helpful in the conversation on reconciliation. It is very long, and I'm going to read all of it, and then I want to kind of pick apart just a few things that he says, kind of delve in a little bit deeper to two things that he says. This is what he says about his interactions with whites as he moves into the northern city of Chicago. This is what he says about reconciliation. He says, I feel that for white America to understand the significance of the problem of the Negro will take a bigger and tougher America than any we have yet known. I feel that America's past is too shallow, her national character too superficially optimistic, her very morality too suffused with color hate for her to accomplish so vast and complex a task. Culturally, the Negro represents a paradox. Though he is an organic part of the nation, he is excluded by the entire tide and direction of American culture. Frankly, it is felt to be wrong to admit him freely. And yet it is felt to be right to exclude him. Therefore, if within the confines of its present culture, the nation ever seeks to purge itself of its color hate, it will find itself at war with itself, convulsed by a spasm of emotional and moral confusion. If the nation ever finds itself examining its real relation to the Negro, it will find itself doing infinitely more than that. Our too young and too new America, lusty because it is lonely, aggressive because it is afraid, insists upon seeing the world in terms of good and bad, holy and evil, the high and the low, the white and the black. Our America is frightened of fact, of history, of processes, of necessity. Now listen to this. It hugs the easy way of damning those whom it cannot understand, of excluding those who look different, and it salves its conscience with a self-draped cloak of righteousness. It hugs the easy way of damning those whom it cannot understand. I think that's a powerful statement. Like, just think on that. The reality of America's history is that we have often tried to take the easy route toward reconciliation. The reality of our history is that we've often done that. We've wanted an easy, quick solution. We wanted to smooth this over and make it better. We've wanted the tension to go away, the fear to go away, and for things just to be all better. And no one knows how big a lie all of that is, better than African American people themselves. Blacks in our country know that is not possible. You can't just smooth something like this over. But we have been so prone to hug the easy way of damning those we cannot understand, to exclude those who look different, and then to cloak ourselves with this self-righteousness. There's another thing he says that I think is important. He says, if we, within the confines of our present culture, should ever seek to purge ourselves of color hate, our nation will find itself at war with itself, convulsed, he says, by a spasm of moral and emotional confusion. I don't know about you, but that has been what the last few months have been characterized by. I feel like that pretty well expresses our present moment. A spasm of moral and emotional confusion. A nation that is convulsed by what exists here. We are attempting to rid ourselves of color hate, as Wright calls it. We're trying to deal with the ugly history of our nation. There is something beautiful and glorious about our nation, we all acknowledge. And we can continue to celebrate that. But as we try to deal with the ugly side of human history, and anytime you deal with history, if it has anything to do with humanity, it always gets ugly. Scripture itself is a testimony to that. The story of God's people is ugly. Over and over again, there are these ugly parts of their history. And you can't just ignore that or smooth that over. You have to try and understand it. You have to try and learn from it. You have to try to hear the word that God is speaking to his people through these really ugly moments in their history. We may find ourselves convulsed by the spasms of moral and emotional confusion. We may find ourselves at war with one another. And that's exactly what's happening. And it's happening not just within our nation, it happens within the church. As we try to purge ourselves of this hatred, what's so hard about it is that we find that we are at war with ourselves. The church is at war with itself. Our nation is at war with itself. That's one of the things I've been thinking about. When you think about monuments, it's been a big part of this conversation. And there's something so beautiful about monuments coming down which celebrate hate. There's something so beautiful about monuments coming down which revere figures who should not be revered or celebrated. They should be remembered, but not revered and celebrated as we have. They should not be romanticized in the way that they have been. And there's something beautiful about those kinds of monuments coming down. But the reality is, as we really try to deal with hate as a part of our history, in particular racism, what we find is that America itself is a monument to racism. America itself is this racist monument. We celebrate America as if this ugly part of who we are, that really shaped us and formed us and made us who we are, we celebrate it as if that does not exist. And so that doesn't mean we can't celebrate it any longer, but we have to celebrate it while also mourning the wrongs, the great sins that have been committed by our nation. And as the church, we still honor the church. We still celebrate what God is doing in the church. But that doesn't mean we don't acknowledge the ugly things that have existed in the church. And though we may feel like, again, the church is at war with itself in these moments, convulsed by the spasm of moral and emotional confusion, that's the reality of reconciliation. That's what it looks like. It is not easy. It is not simple. It's complex and painful. I love this other statement he makes about America. He says, to understand the significance of the problem of blacks in our nation will take a bigger and tougher America than any we have yet known. He says America's past is too shallow, and we have this tendency to be superficially optimistic. We talk about the greatness and the glory and the grandness from sea to shining sea, and yet we aren't as capable of acknowledging the wrong. And so we have a very shallow history, he says, a superficially optimistic history. And we have to move past that. We have to be willing to deal with the emotional and moral confusion. We have to be willing to deal with the pain of feeling like we are at war with ourselves as we try to rid ourselves of this kind of hate. It's an important conversation to be being had. And I think for too long we've waited for politics to settle the matter. We've waited for politicians to write bills, to pass laws that will smooth this thing over, that will make things fair and just. And what we have to realize is that there is no fairness and there is no justice in this conversation. It will be hard for us to ever make right what has been done. And we've waited too long for these institutions to do that for us. Even the institutional church, I think believers within the church have kind of hoped that maybe churches and institutions and denominations would be able to do this. And we've forgotten our role as individuals. We've looked to institutions to solve the problem. We've looked to people that we voted into positions of power and authority, and we've ignored our own role. Because the thing that I'm convinced of, Jonathan and I have talked about this now for years in conversations with one another and within our church. Ultimately, we believe reconciliation will begin in homes. Reconciliation has to begin in these sorts of spaces. Like, we can't expect to be reconciled to our black brothers and sisters if they're not welcome in our own homes, if we don't have real relationships with them. We can't expect to be reconciled and to see this equity in our relationship with them if we're not in those kinds of spaces with them. Like, reconciliation begins in parks, at the ball field with your kids. Reconciliation begins at these school gatherings, at PTA meetings. Reconciliation begins around tables. And I think far too rarely do we find ourselves around the table with those who look different from us. And if there's anything we know about Jesus, it is that he always put himself around the table with people who looked different from him, who were condemned, who were marginalized, who were the forgotten ones in his society. We have to proactively seek this out. We have to be looking from these places, from these relationships, to cultivate something. Reconciliation is cultivated in these simple individual relationships around the table. And if we can cultivate reconciliation there, then we can begin to look at the institutional level. But we tend to do everything backwards, I believe. And in moments like our culture is in right now, like, we want institutional change, and rightfully so. And that doesn't mean we need to abandon institutional change. That doesn't mean we need to abandon the conversations that are being had about what laws could be passed in terms of policing practices, right? In terms of what it looks like for those who want to have a conversation on reparations, or what it looks like to even start that conversation, right? All these things are very complicated and controversial. And I think, honestly, those conversations at the institutional level would go so much easier if they were built upon what were real relationships. If the first time we were having that conversation, it was not at the institutional level, I think so much more change would be possible. And that's what we believe. And that's what the church has to be pushing toward. That doesn't mean our church needs to suddenly become only about racial reconciliation. The only thing that we're concerned about is getting people in our church that look different than us. That is a part of the gospel. And in the city of Birmingham, it is a part that cannot be neglected or forgotten. But we don't need to think that has to happen at the institutional level first. We don't need to create a program for it. The thing we have to be aware of is that ultimately this is about relationship. That is where these things will change. It's like so many other things, right? We get bothered when we see what's happening right now in our country. There is such division, whether it's about the pandemic and how it should be dealt with, whether it's about the election that is coming up, or whether it's about the racial tension that exists right now. We want to see change. And so the first thing we start talking about most of the time are people who are in power at the federal level. We start thinking about the president and the vice president. We start thinking about their cabinet. We start thinking about the people they've appointed. We think about people in Congress, and I think we fail to think about our own mayor, to think about what it looks like in our own city councils. We fail to think about what it looks like on the church level, on our block. That's where we fail. That's where we fall short over and over again. And it doesn't mean we shouldn't think about this much larger scope of what's happening on the national level, but it means we cannot neglect what's happening on the local level and in our own lives as individuals. And I think that's what it looks like to move forward, to take seriously what Paul is saying to Philemon. What does it look like for us to allow our relationships not just to be mended, but completely transformed? No longer seeing Onesimus in the same way. He wants Philemon to see him as a brother, as a partner in ministry. How do we begin to see African Americans, and for those in our church that are African Americans, how do they begin to see their white brothers and sisters in this transformed sort of way? How do we move beyond merely forgiveness? How do we see real reconciliation take place? How do we move beyond hugging it out and the warm, fuzzy experience of feeling like everything's going to be okay, and really stepping into that, to the ugly, complex conversations that have to take place in order for that to work? And that's what we want. That's what we're praying about. And I hope you'll continue to reflect on these things and pray about these things and think about this more at an individual level than at a programmatic or institutional level. You need to be thinking about it at the institutional level, obviously. But what does it look like for us as individuals? It's too easy for us to kind of push that down the road, to put it on somebody else's plate and ignore how it's right there in front of us, how we have a role to play in all of this, how there are things we could be doing to see change. And that's what we want. That's what we desire. So if you would, pray with me in these moments, and then the conversation can continue. Father, I just ask in these moments that you grant us understanding of our own history. You'd help us to kind of grapple with the ugly sides of our history, and to be okay with the fact that it may feel like moral and emotional confusion, as Richard Wright says. It may feel ugly and painful. But God, I pray we'd be willing to kind of steer ourselves into those deeper waters. We'd be willing to swim out into those deeper waters where things are difficult, where it's a little scary and uncomfortable, so that we can see real reconciliation, and not just to be talking about this in the moments where these tensions kind of flare up, but to be talking about this continually, to be continually seeking justice in our nation for those who've been oppressed. Help us to see how that looks. Help us to see how central that is to the gospel of the kingdom, and may we be transformed. May our relationships be transformed. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
Let's see if this works. Okay. Hopefully this is working for them. But yeah, so questions, comments, something that the Lord's laid on your heart, feel free to ask or to talk.
You're in Cal anyway.
Yes. Hey, Kyle. Kyle, can you switch to the phone audio? The well, the it's just it keeps cutting in and out. Nothing. Now you sound Now you sound really, really far away.
Man, choking the baby. The wind went dark.
Oh. Now we lost Kyle altogether. Let's see. We now see you, Kyle. Are there any other, while Kyle's figuring audio out, is there any other questions or comments? What's up, Max? Hey, there you are. You sound good now. Alex, do we need to wait on you for the last minute questions before we call it? You're our go-to last minute question asker. Yeah, no, I think that that's a valid input. One, and this is, I think, anyone that's been in this fight for some time now will say or kind of like talk about how it is exhausting and like it's really easy to become fatigued on it because like I mean I don't even know if you guys would feel this, but having now read and like all my podcasts and news feed has been generally around this the last few months, and I found myself like thinking the other day like I just want to read a book about something besides this. And whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, like that's like just an honest thing of where I'm beginning to find myself of like, oh, like I just want to read something else for like a couple of weeks. And then I think about that that's my privilege, one, and that like I'm able to like choose to be a part of this or not. But like so just the fatigue of it and then the reality of it is like yeah, like I thought about Kyle and I's last two sermons, like the passages haven't sort of naturally lended themselves to the topics, and like we've made references in our sermons still where like a couple of passages before that were like spot on, partially because we knew what we were trying to accomplish. But it's like yeah, you're not going to preach every single sermon series on racial reconciliation. The most passages will give nod to it. I think what you're saying, Alex, is like it doesn't stay on the surface naturally all the time. And so I was thinking the same thing. I never even thought about something like a creed, or you could always do a confession, and that's I think where a space of like something we as Mosaic don't practice that we've had moments that we've practiced is a confession of sin, and in it, not like explicitly stated in that, but what we say in the confession of sin is we confess sins that have been done and that have been left undone, is language that's used. Sins that we're aware of and that we're unaware of. And I think that there could be space in a city like Birmingham to name some of those things more regularly. Like maybe it's not an every week thing, or there are in other traditions, there are things like pastoral prayers, or there's like if you've been a part of Anglican services, they pray for government every week and they name the officials and they pray for those things. And I think that there are those types of like spaces where you could like in praying for those things and naming those things week in and week out, it would be a natural spot to pray for like these types of conversations because they're not disconnected from those things. And so there is a space to create liturgy, I think, that recognizes this and that puts words to it and identifies it week in and week out, even if it's not expanded week in and week out, but that you're touching it and that you're kind of like you're not allowing it to go to the background. Because if what Kyle is saying is true, and I think most of us would agree with it, this isn't something that gets solved in a week. It's something that's going to continue to take years. And we said that during this course at the start, like in no way, shape, or form do we think doing a 5 week class like now, like oh Mosaic can just stop talking about this. Like we hope that just like 2 years ago started conversations on like going to see the EJI and all of that. Like we hope that it would be the start of something. Like and now for 2 years we've seen it expand and we've seen people learn and grow and it become more a part of the culture of our community. Like we do not think that this class will just fix this. Like we think that this class is a springboard into more into like allowing us to have more conversations and hopefully become something that doesn't get ignored or forgotten about. That's I think that's a great idea of thinking how you can incorporate it into our like liturgical patterns and rhythms. Um, I like that. Yeah, I think that you can just throw money at things and wash your hands of it and walk away. Like that is possible, but then also in the same way that on an individual level, I think on a corporate level, where you put your money like matters, and so I do think that that is helpful. And to be completely honest, like part of the reason, not saying we'll like do this immediately, but like the way we restructured our giving in such that like we guaranteed a certain amount of money to our different people each month was so that when we have an excess of giving, we can give to things like this that are more kind of in the moment, or like at the end of the year we can kind of look back and go, okay, like what have we grown, where have we kind of like what's on the heartbeat of our community, and is there something outside of these things that we're committed to giving month in and month out to that we would be interested in like partnering in or participating with or alongside of, or something that pops up in the middle of a year that we weren't planning on. And so, I mean, as we give above what is budgeted, like we intend to still set that money aside to give to things like this that are like more. It sounds to say passion projects, it demeans what we give to, but I think you guys know what I'm saying. It's like as extra giving is around, we hope to give to things outside of just the things that we commit to month in and month out. So that I mean, like that's these ideas, and as these opportunities pop up, I think it goes beyond city mission, and it's something as we look to next year, more ideas like this, and as people find things to donate to, like we want to contribute to the things that y'all are like passionate about, because like it's not just me and Kyle or the elders' money. Like it is the community's money, and we want to continue to give it to where it's needed, and where we think would be best for like where Mosaic is going and who Mosaic is. So I mean, we're always open to more ideas like that as we come across them. Hey, Alex, could you start over?
Can't hear you.
Kyle, are you trying to say it's okay for people to shout us down in the middle of a sermon? I guess we also need to teach people to clap on the downbeat while we're talking about it, right? Isn't it the one and the three? Uh. Well, hey, we appreciate everybody being a part of this, and this is all streaming onto YouTube as well. So, if people are watching, we appreciate that you would tune in and be a part of it. Like we said, this concludes the class time, but hopefully, this does not conclude our conversation. and our time or our energy being focused around this. We get that it is hard sometimes to give yourself to this, but we think it's worthwhile, and that's why we are honest about that, and we continue to encourage one another to, fight the good fight, as they say. And so, our class time is going to shift starting this week, Thursday night. We're going to start a class at 6:30 on sexuality, politics, and practicing the way of Jesus, kind of part two, and continue to see how that conversation goes. And so we encourage you guys to be a part of that as well. And it'll be a general or similar format, similar kind of discussion of just like talking about these things that are cultural conversations and cultural things, and also understanding that they're things that the church hasn't always handled super well and has a lot of bad reputation, I guess, in culture about how we talk about it. And so we just kind of want to present a different way to talk about these things and to discuss these things, and in the same way, like lay out like where we stand on these issues and kind of how we want to be dialoguing about them and things like that. So that'll be Thursday night at 6:30. Same format, Zoom. You can join us up here at least for now. If the numbers keep going up, we'll see how that gets handled. And then we'll be on YouTube and things like that as well. So we hope that you guys would find yourself engaging and participating in that. So thanks. We enjoyed it. Glad that y'all were a part of it. So Tuesday night small group. Love you guys. Glad to see you in the backyard.
But there was a gang sang through them. What was that?
It's a